welcome. And it's so wonderful. I'm really happy to see this workshop exists, and I hope we can do really amazing things to improve the accessibility of publications so everybody can participate in research. I'll get my screen here. All right. So I titled this talk, pretty plainly, accessibility. And to me, papers are kind of the user interface. So I'm an HCI researcher, and the papers are sort of the user interface that we have to access scientific knowledge. And so to me, there's a really deep connection about things we think about with making user interfaces accessible and how we think about making papers accessible. And machine learning and then papers. And I structured this talk. It basically, there's a brief introduction to at least one way that I think about accessibility, and accessibility in particular for people with disabilities or people who are going to be using the interfaces that we create in different ways. And then diving in specifically into papers and into PDF as a format and kind of the limitations there. And then some of the things that other communities are doing and things that we might consider, how we might adopt it. ICLR or other ML venues. So I'll jump right in. So accessibility might be a new topic for a lot of people. And I've spent probably the last 15, 20 years trying different ways to try to motivate what accessibility is. And so I've got some of the common things that people say. So sometimes people say, because it's true, more than 15% of the US population, probably a little bit more of the world population, has a disability. One thing, sometimes people say things like, you have or will have a disability if you're lucky enough to live long enough. And, situational impairments affect us all. So sometimes I talk about, you're walking down the street and you're trying to, read a text. Well, imagine you're, on a tiny screen trying to read a paper in PDF format that doesn't allow you to easily reflow the content. So maybe that's a situational impairment. But I think in a lot of ways, people still see accessibility as niche, as kind of this thing that affects, a small group of people that aren't them. As more of a technologist who's interested in kind of how people interact with things, I actually think that the opposite is true. And so the way that we tend to think about kind of not accessibility, to me, reflects a very narrow set of particular abilities that people are able to use. So we usually think about kind of high visual acuity, for instance, and high motor dexterity for the kinds of interfaces that we build. And so, to me, I've had this little dot here, this little blue dot, that's kind of not accessibility. And any other way you could imagine interacting with something is accessibility in a very real sense. And so from the accessibility perspective, and how it relates to interaction and how we've thought about interaction over the years, I look back at some of the big advances. So Engelbart's mouse, keyboards, motherboard demos, where so many of the paradigms that kind of just pervade how we use computers now were introduced, or the work that happened at Park with windowing systems, and still how most GUIs are kind of thought about. And I feel like this is sort of locking in certain ability assumptions, right? And so you can even see, the particular assumptions about, the number of fingers somebody has to be able to use in this case, the 3-button mouse, or the visual acuity they need to be able to kind of see this tiny visual information, high resolution, even at the time, high resolution visual information on the screen. And so to me, what this has indicated is, we've really made progress in interaction with computers. And I think we also sort of have made progress in, how we think about, dissemination of scientific research by sort of locking in certain ability assumptions. And unfortunately, when we do that, we lock some people out. And I just realized I did not click whatever magic button there is to share my screen with sound. And so I'm going to very quickly stop sharing and share again. In any case, the video that is going to play here, this is Steve Jobs introducing the iPhone, and there's this little clip of the keynote where he essentially says, we're going to use the interaction method that everybody has, which is their fingers. And right there, it's yet another example of ability assumption that gets locked in. And so one way I've kind of characterized how people have seen the users of their user interfaces, whether those are, the graphical user interfaces on a windowing system or the iPhone or the papers that we produce, is, as kind of these little caricatures of what the fullness of humans are. And so, in the case of a touchscreen device, you might see this little homunculus person by Ego and O'Sullivan, where they illustrated the fact that, especially the early touchscreen devices could only really see, or only use one finger as input, had no notion of stereo vision and maybe tiny little ears to listen to stereo audio. And think about like, well, what is the equivalent of little homunculus person for our research papers in the formats and the ways that we publish them. All right, so, and this is the last slide about accessibility is sort of ability assumptions, but as an area, accessibility has tried a whole bunch of different things, and it's a really fascinating space to work in, where we do things like try to expand out the modality. So what happens if somebody doesn't have high acuity vision or the motor dexterity to be able to kind of finally manipulate things? Like, how do we enable interaction? And then a recognition of the fact that there's just a huge amount of interactions out there that people have designed assuming certain ability assumptions. So how do you translate between them, right? So if somebody's made like a visual interface, well, how do we convey that non-visually? Turns out there's a whole bunch of features that have been developed for this. So I have a little picture here of the iPhone accessibility settings, which I encourage you all to play with. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do, but like, how does somebody realize, well, if those 50 some features, like what benefits them? So that's actually become a problem. And then there's this huge legacy problem. And I know we have this in software, and we certainly have this in our research publications as well, where, even if we magically fixed the accessibility of all the applications, all the web pages, all the PDFs that are produced by our research communities today, we'd still have decades of legacy of inaccessible stuff that we'd somehow need to deal with. And if you think about it, like each one of these things has a really nice connection to machine learning, right? So if we expand out modalities, that's what a lot of people are interested in, right? So how do we enable computers to be able to understand, not just kind of touches or clicks on screens, but more natural interactions of speech or gestures or other things like this. Translation, maybe not what people think of necessarily in ML as translation all the time, but translating between one kind of mode of input or output into another. That's definitely in the realm. Making things discoverable is essentially recommender systems and legacy problems. Actually, I think this is where ML actually probably has the biggest opportunity to play a role, where we are not going to be able to probably send people off to make every single application or research paper that's been produced in the past accessible, but maybe we can build ML systems that could do that or help make it easier or more efficient. So lots of things there. As one example of just a research project that we've worked on pretty recently, this is a project called screen recognition. We just submitted this, or actually it'll appear at Chi in next week or a couple of weeks, where it's exactly looking at this problem, but for software. And so in particular, iOS applications, where we built a computer vision model to be able to recognize all of the different user interface elements on a particular iOS screen. So everything from like the buttons and the checkboxes, and recognize the text with OCR, and give a shot at trying to figure out what the icons and pictures are about. And that's intended to help give voice over users. So this is a screen reader that people who are blind would use on iOS, to be able to access applications that developers didn't create with accessibility in mind. And so, and we definitely purposely and very intentionally position this as, a tool to help make up for problems that exist in applications, as opposed to, something where, a developer wouldn't have to do their good due diligence, because this is never going to be, or at least not in the near term, would be as good as what a developer designer of the app could do. But at the same time, we just know every single platform that has existed, even if it technically is possible to be made accessible, in practice, the biggest problem is the applications and the lack of the metadata and semantics being provided for that application to make it so that it can be reconfigured. And one of the things we talk about a lot, just because it's I think it's both sort of concrete for people and also a little bit more straightforward than some of the more nuanced types of accessibility changes, is we talk about what would it take for a screen reader user, so a person who is blind, to be able to access this thing. And a lot of people, it's very interesting for them to think about, like, what does it even mean? Like, this visual application, how could you possibly do that? Turns out there's tools like VoiceOver that make this possible, but only with developer support. And there's just a huge number of applications that don't do it well. All right, but anyway, so that is like the first half of the talk. What does any of this have to do with papers? As was mentioned in the introduction, I have had this long-standing sort of gripe and complaint on Twitter, especially about the inaccessibility of research papers. And the short story is that so much of what we do in research is disseminated as PDF documents. This is what appears on the ACM Digital Library. It's what appears on our web pages. So this is a snapshot of my web page from 5 years ago. So you can see I've at least been complaining about this for 5 years. And it's what we assign in reading seminars. It's what we email to colleagues. And with only a small amount of nuance to this, I am comfortable saying that none of these documents are accessible in any of the ways that I kind of alluded to in the prior slides. So it's very difficult for anyone who would need to use these documents in a way that isn't the assumed sort of visual consumption on a large screen to be able to use them well. And it's also very difficult, and this is even a step beyond what I think for like iOS applications or web pages, it's really difficult for authors to make them accessible. It's possible, and I think it's important that we note that it's something that everyone should do, and it's something that I require of my lab, for instance, regardless of where we're publishing, but it's not especially easy. And if we think about how underrepresented people with disabilities are in science, it's not the only problem, but the fact that our late-breaking work and our wide body of knowledge, like the corpus that anything that you would assign to a graduate student, is very likely not to be easily or maybe even possibly used by a person who is blind, can't be helping that problem. And so I mentioned you can make PDF documents accessible, and it's a little bit more complicated than this, but if you started with LaTeX, for instance, which I think especially in ML communities, in HCI, it's like half the people use Word, which has, you can poke fun at them, but it turns out Word is much better at making accessible PDFs. But anyway, if we're using, LaTeX or Overleaf, it simply doesn't work with the output that comes directly. And the only practical way is to go into Adobe Acrobat and use a feature that was added, as far as I can tell, about 15 years ago. It has been minimally updated since. And you go through and then you kind of draw little boxes around each part of the text. And you say, like, this is the title. This is, these are the text that goes together. And then you add alternative text descriptions to images, which people don't tend to do very well. And then you can have a PDF document that's accessible. It's just really hard. Here's a problem. This has been a problem for the entirety of PDF accessibility. If you don't do this sort of tagging, the readers do really dumb things. So here's Adobe Acrobat trying to read this. Maybe you won't hear the audio, but you can kind of see this faint outline of yellow. So basically what it's doing is there's two columns, and visually you can see this, there's two columns, and it's just not respecting the columns. And so it's just going from first sentence or the first line in the first column over to the first line in the second column, and back and forth and back and forth. And of course, this isn't just for screen reader users. It's also sort of kind of a pain to read these things on mobile devices. And at this point, I always like to point out there's many smart people in this talk and that I talk to, and I always get into, and I somehow find myself always getting into this conversation despite I just capture at some point, right? Because it's always the same. It's like, oh, we could solve that, and yes, all of these problems are solvable, right? So this is probably one of the easiest machine learning problems in a way, But then it's like you hit this wall of engineering and all of this hard work that nobody really wants to do, and it's a lot trickier than anyone believes at the beginning, to deal with the PDF format and the many different ways that PDFs are created. And so I encourage you all to work on it, but realize many heroes have fallen in your before you. Let's see. So most papers aren't accessible. That's you know, we did these various made these various charts. You know, we looked at Chi. Chi for the longest time was hovering around 10 or 15% of papers. These are all kind of HCI oriented and accessibility conferences. And at the time, it was like, well, if anybody's doing it, it's these venues. And you'll see that Assets and W4A have done a lot better, mostly because somebody goes in and requires it and bugs the authors if they don't do it. I would guess if we look at ICLR or any of the machine learning venues, it would be hovering right around 0% of papers with almost no exaggeration that have the tags that would enable these papers to be accessible. Let's see, where am I at here? And there's different ways, we manually check these. It's a ton of work and it's confusing. Let's see. So why is this happening? Well, it should be no surprise. Nobody, most people don't even know that they should probably do this. If you go into Overleaf, it doesn't produce accessible PDFs, and so you have to go buy or have a license for Adobe Acrobat, use this kind of clunky process. I could go into my endless gripes of Adobe Acrobat, which I only gripe about because it's literally the only tool that you can use to do this. And it has bugs that have existed that I have run into since 2016. One of those that happens a lot is if you try to make a PDF accessible, you add alternative text, so a description of an image, it adds this hidden font, which just completely trips up every publisher because you didn't embed your font, and you can't embed it. Well, you can, but it's really complicated. I have the steps here on the screen, but it's you open this weird pre-flight, you embed the fonts even if they're invisible, and then sometimes it still doesn't even work. And so I think it's kind of a weird talk to be here kind of complaining about the bugs of Adobe Acrobat. And I want to point out that I also agree that it's really weird for me to be here pointing out the bugs of Adobe Acrobat. And at the same time, this kind of mundane but terrible set of tools is what is making our research publications not possible for a bunch of people to use. So I published this paper, kind of a gripey paper, but documenting this, and I called it an uninteresting tour of why our research papers aren't accessible. And the point that was being made is that these are not big challenging problems for that need research. It's a set of decisions that we've made, and a set of not well-meaning people that have kind of come together around we're just trying to get our research out, and look, these papers work for a lot of people, and now coming back decades later trying to then retrofit onto these PDFs what we probably should have done, not probably, what we should have thought of from the beginning, but now we haven't. And it turns out it's really hard, and nobody's really willing to do the substantial work to make it better. So but it's not, we don't have completely lost hope. So there's different things that we've tried, and then there's different things that are happening in the community to make this better. So the first thing that communities tend to try is they ask and encourage, right? So this is from I think this is from Chi. Yeah, this is Chi 2015. Basically, they start with instructions like, hey, if you want to make your paper accessible, here's how you go about it. We have volunteered in my lab. This is a couple of years ago. We just made all the papers accessible. It takes a long time. It's really, and it's not the most fun work, but we did that. Assets started requiring it. So, you could imagine, would ICLR ever would ICLR ever say, you have to make your PDFs accessible, or, you won't publish them. Ultimately, I think that probably the most reliable and ultimately the unsatisfying best answer for a lot of people despite people's objections, is to pay people. So, have an editor do it. So at WIS 2015, we actually paid someone to make all the papers accessible. And then of course you can make better tools. And this is also what people jump into. You could totally make better tools, but I'll get to some efforts here about how that's kind of tricky. So yeah, so I mean, there's options. We could pay for accessibility. Well, I mean, the option we have right now is just make none of our papers accessible, which I think is the thing that we've sort of defaulted to. We could pay for accessibility. We could kind of wait for better tools. We could require authors to do it. Or, what I actually think would be great too, although there's a whole ecosystem of tooling problem here, is getting rid of PDFs entirely, right? So wouldn't it be great if we just natively publish our papers in something else like HTML or EPUB or other formats where it's a lot easier to make papers accessible. But I'll conclude. I know just a tiny bit over time. I'll conclude with 2 or 3 things that are happening in the community. So ACM has been working on, and it's a long slog. If anybody sort of publishes in ACM venues, it's sort of a long slog, but they've been working on a publishing process which is called TAPS. And everyone's confused by this, but one of the things that it does is it tries to capture the content of the papers in a way that then can be delivered in multiple different formats. And so this is basically you submit as an author the source of your paper, and then a largely manual, but I think the idea is maybe eventually to make it more automated process produces a HTML version of the paper, a PDF version of the paper, and in the future they could do more like EPUB or whatever else. And these formats can be made accessible a lot easier. And so they're trying this. Another thing, and another place where I will just warn everyone on the call who's probably, if I've at all inspired anyone to work on this, they might think I could probably fix LaTeX. And you think about it, it's like, wow, LaTeX already has a lot of the things that you would want there, right? Like it has a structure, you know where the paragraphs are. So why should it be, jumping from column to column? And you could add like a new field for if you wanted to have a description for an image. It turns out LaTeX, like PDF, they're both kind of like these, old monster systems, right? That have been kind of like, they're great in their own way, but like they've been built upon for decades, and actually getting anything like this to work, and especially going from LaTeX, which is its own kind of monster system, to produce accessible PDFs, which is its own sort of monster system. There's lots of really hard challenges. And so very recently, the folks that actually know a lot about LaTeX, who kind of plan the next releases of LaTeX, they issued a paper, ironically in PDF, that outlines a multi-year project to enable LaTeX to naturally support the creation of structured document formats, in particular tag PDFs that are required for accessibility. And so there is this multi-year process. So people know how to do it, but it's not like, you're going to have, which I think many people, including myself, very naively thought, oh, I'll hire an undergrad to like investigate this for a summer. Maybe we can fix it. It's not quite that scale of a problem. But like, and then people are also kind of changing, how the conference submission process works. So I've talked a lot about kind of papers in the abstract, but one thing we're realizing is that the papers at submission time are even less likely to be accessible. Everyone's racing up to the deadline, and they barely get their last version in. And so people like WIST, which is one of the main HCI conferences in ACM, they allowed people to submit their paper, and then after the fact, make it accessible. So they gave people more time to make their paper accessible, so they wouldn't have to make this trade-off between submitting an accessible version of their paper, which could be reviewed by people with disabilities. So not just consumed sometime down the line when at the camera ready, but if there's actually people with disabilities on the program committees, which is obviously something we want to enable, then you can make your paper even accessible at camera ready time. So I've gone through a bunch of different things. I wish I had a really great solution. I don't have a really great solution. I have railed against PDF as a format for a very long time because I just feel like there's not the tools. It's really hard to build the tools. And so, it doesn't seem like a great solution. But there's many different options, right? And I think as we think about what this will mean for making sure everyone has access to our research and to produce research. I haven't even gotten into the inaccessibility of research production tools. So, surprise, overleaf's not accessible to lots of different people. I think it's just something that we should take pretty seriously. So I will end there, and I don't know if there's time for questions or how we want to do this, but I appreciate you all inviting me, and I hope we can make progress on this.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. That these are all really ideas that resonate with the workshop. And I can see there's already lots of questions on Rocket Chat. So what I will do is we take a couple of questions live since we have about 3 minutes remaining, but all of the questions that we aren't able to get to, you could just look at Rocket Chat after and respond there in chat. But yeah, one really interesting question is, do you have any thoughts about accessibility for other kinds of impairments that are not necessarily visual? And are there tools that exist, and what's the outlook like?
Yeah, so I mean, there is a huge, rich area of accessibility that covers all kinds of different. I guess a slide I didn't put on here is usually I have a slide that has some breakdown of just the many different kinds of people and abilities that we think about in computing. Everything from obviously I talked a lot about screen reader users and being blind. There's a whole spectrum of a vision from low vision. What does it mean to magnify? Like, how do you consume content that's like different scales? There's cognitive disabilities. So what would it mean to be able to produce research content that is able to be consumed in a variety of ways that would better support people that that need different accommodations there. I think that it's more complicated than this. But one thing that I think in a practical step, and why I always go back to these PDFs and complaining about them and how do we get away from PDF, is that there's a lot of transformations that we can do to content. And if you look, I had that slide with the 50 features on iOS. A lot of it comes down to, if we can't computationally access the content and therefore manipulate it and transform it, then it's really hard to accommodate any different way of using these our research output. And so, for instance, for low vision, what you'd really want is something that can be reflowed, so that you're not doing this kind of awful thing where and I've showed that one picture of it where you've got like a static paper, like a PDF document, doesn't reflow as you make it bigger. Or even for somebody with a cognitive impairment, there's lots of different kinds of accommodations that might make sense. But reading that, even if you're able to see the visual of the paper, being able to read the content out loud with text to speech, or being able to highlight portions of it while you read, for some people that can be beneficial. But some of the same types of things, like the inability to access the innards of the PDF and the text content, and just know basic stuff about like where paragraphs are and things like that, they also apply. Or if you need to change the colors, or you need to change the font, or you need to change all of these things, then I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so the next speaker can go. It kind of boils down to a lot of the same things. And then at that point, once you then have like a base level of access, then you can think about, well, what do we do to even do better, right? Because there's a million different things I imagine that are like more inventive things. And isn't just like dealing with the problems of PDF. And I would love us to get to a foundation where we can say, well, everything we know how to do is now there in our papers. And let's innovate and do something even cooler, support people better, like figure out what would actually be great for somebody with certain disabilities. Or but unfortunately, we're always struggling with this just base foundation, and that makes it really hard to get there.